Today we're in the book of Exodus, chapter 3. This time we're back to God calling double names. It's a familiar story to everybody in the room. Even our children can tell the story of God speaking to Moses from the burning bush. Let's just briefly understand why Moses is around the bush. It's an interesting story, one that you already know. Moses, of course, was born in Egypt excuse me, to a set of parents that were slaves. He's a slave baby. And legally, his parents were to kill him. They were to destroy all male babies. But they didn't do it. Amram and Jochebed were his parents, and instead they hid Moses for 3 months. And finally, when it was impossible to hide this baby any longer, the mother devised a plan, and the little basket that had been taken care of so it would float, and they floated it by Pharaoh's daughter as she went down to the Nile River to bathe. And Pharaoh's daughter found this little baby, and like a lot of women, she's going to take it home. Some women like to take home a little dog, maybe. It's cute. And if it was a baby, it would be even more important. So this little slave baby grew up in Pharaoh's palace. Now, I'm not here this morning to try to explain to you the blessings of growing up in Pharaoh's palace. It's a different world than he would have grown up as a slave. But one of the things, when God's hand was in it all, Pharaoh's daughter said, I need a nurse for this baby. And Moses' little sister said, I'll find you one, and went home and told her mother. And in reality, Moses grew up in Pharaoh's house, and his guardian was his own mother. Talk about the providence of God. So Moses really had a very interesting background. He grew up in the palace of one of the most powerful men on the face of this earth, with all of the blessings and all of the things that Pharaoh could accumulate, while at the same time he had a mother who was teaching him about God. Well, as a young man, Pharaoh understood that this young boy might just very well someday become the new Pharaoh. Now, that's an interesting proposition. But this young boy, Moses, knew that he was a Hebrew. He was not an Egyptian. And one day, as he was walking out into the area around the palace area, he saw an Egyptian mistreating a Hebrew slave. And Moses was angered. And he looked this way, and he looked that way, didn't see anybody. And he killed the Egyptian. Moses murdered a man. And he knew he'd gotten away with it. But there were two witnesses. God, of course. And the other witness was the Egyptian slave that he was trying to save. And he went out and told everybody they would listen. And finally the news was out, and the Egyptian authorities were looking for him. And Moses did something that a lot of men have done. He fled. He fled to the northeast, up into the hill country, up into the desert area, up into the area where nobody lives except a few shepherds that tend their flock. There he married the daughter of Jethro, who is nothing but a nomadic shepherd. Now to the 3rd chapter of the book of Exodus. Moses is tending to the flock of Jethro. It's a lonely job. You go out, you leave home, you're gone for days, you take your food with you. Sometimes you even have to take your water with you to find water decent to drink. And you sleep under the stars around your sheep. The Bible doesn't tell us how long he'd been out there. But one day Moses observed something that he knew was out of place. One of those desert bushes is on fire. And by the way, historians say that was not uncommon. But the thing that caught Moses' eye was he watched it for quite some time and the bush didn't burn up. The scripture says Moses went over to check this thing out. And then we have our two words. Moses, Moses, take your shoes off, for this is holy ground. In the verses that follow, and you know them well, God tells Moses that he wants him to do something. He wants him to go back to Egypt and lead the Hebrew people out of Egypt. Now, who's God speaking to? On the surface, he's speaking to a shepherd who has no experience in leadership. He's speaking to a man who really doesn't know anything but sheep. But God has prepared him. This man, Moses, knows about Egypt. He was born there. He lived there. He has family there. Not only does he know Egypt, he knows the Pharaoh. Now, the Pharaoh he knows is dead, but he knows the Pharaoh, how they live. He knows a lot about the upper crust of society in Egypt. He knows about slavery in Egypt. And he knows about the God that has spoken to him. In other words, God has a mission for Moses, and God has prepared him. And then you know what happens next. Moses begins to make excuses. Well, the first excuse is really a question. He says to the Lord, "Who am I? I'm just a shepherd out here." God ignores that to a large extent. Who am I? The answer to that question is, you are the person that God has prepared for this. Then Moses says, Lord, if I do go and try to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, who do I say sent me? Now God answers this question. He said, you just tell their people that the great I Am has sent you. I am the God of heaven. I am your God. I am your creator. Just tell them the I Am has sent you. Well, that doesn't satisfy Moses. He asked another question, one that Vinton Morgan would ask, and probably one you would ask. What if I go down there and tell them the great I Am has sent me to deliver you out of Egypt? What if they don't believe me? That's a legitimate question. What if they don't believe me? God said, here's what you do. I've got some things that I want you to do, and when you do them, they will believe you. You remember what they are? Well, first of all, God asked, what do you have in your hand? And he had a shepherd's staff. Today we might call it a very tall, crooked walking stick. He said, cast it down on the ground. So he threw it down on the ground. And it turned into a snake. I've often had people say, what kind of snake was it? I don't know what kind of snake it was, but I know what Moses did. He got away from it. So it wasn't a little garter snake. Then God says, Moses, pick the thing up by the tail. And Moses did, and it turned into a shepherd's staff again. God says, if they don't believe that, then try something else. Take your hand and put it into your garment like this. So Moses did. And when he pulled it out, that hand and arm was covered with leprosy. Now, most of us in this room would not be able to identify leprosy. Okay? But in the ancient world, leprosy was the dreaded disease of all. And people understood what leprosy was. It was in Egypt. It was among the slaves. Leprosy was the curse physically of the ancient world. Moses, put your hand in there and pull it out and show the people. And there was an understanding among the ancient people, if there's a man that has leprosy or a woman, you get away from them. Because they did not understand how that disease was transferred. He said, now Moses, put your hand back in there. Which he did. He pulled it out, and it looked just like the rest of him. God says, if they don't believe those two, let's try one more. When you get down into Egypt, get you a basket that was waterproof, or a bucket as we would call it today, and go down to the Nile River and get you a bucket of water. Let them watch you get that water and bring it up to where the people are, and then pour it out on the ground. And it will be blood. Water to blood. God says, they'll believe you now. And then Moses tries one more time. Lord, all that's good and fine, But you know, I'm not a very good speaker. In our language today, we might say, Lord, I'm not a good public speaker. I get my words mixed up. I might stutter a little bit. You know, all of that. You know, it says God, anger was kindled against Moses. He says, I have a solution for that. You've got a brother named Aaron, and by the way, he's just coming up the mountain right now to see you. He's a good speaker. You tell him what to say, and I'll tell you what to say. And with those words, Moses headed back to Egypt. Now, this morning, what are we going to learn from this story and this passage? First of all, there's a very important principle, and the reason I called it important principle is because Jesus did later. Let's look at a verse in the 3rd chapter here. It's actually verse 6 of the 3rd chapter. God said, I am the God of your father, Amram. I'm the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, I don't know, because I didn't count them, how many times that's found in this chapter and the next chapter. God says, I'm the God of your father, Moses. I'm also the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, Moses knows his daddy. And at the time this was said, his father may be dead. He also knows who Abraham was. Abraham had been dead for hundreds of years. Moses knew who Isaac was. And he certainly knew who Jacob was. They're dead. But notice the passages. This one is the first one. I am the God of these dead men. In Matthew, Jesus said, as he taught during his ministry, he went back to that very verse and said to the Jews, God is not the God of the dead. He's the God of the living. And to prove it, he went to this passage. That brings our attention to two things. As we mentioned in Sunday school class, when we die on this earth, our bodies die. Our souls do not die. We're alive. And our God is the same God we have on this earth. Jehovah God. We don't die to God. We don't understand the spirit world. We can understand it. But we understand that the God that loves us here is the same God that will love us when we leave this world. God is the God of the living, not the dead. And the Lord Jesus Christ made his argument on this very verse. That's important. Jesus thought it was important. There's something else we need to learn from this verse, or verses. God had a plan for Moses. God had prepared Moses, but Moses had no idea what was going on. God had prepared this slave child to be the magnificent leader that would direct the children of Israel out of Egypt and take them to the promised land. God had a plan. Folks, Moses isn't in this room today. I don't think. But just as a Christian, we understand God has a plan for us. Solomon in the Old Testament probably summed it up very quickly. God's plan for us is to love God and keep His commandments. But there's more to it. God gave a mission to Christians, and we've talked about it a million times, to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. I was looking at the calendar of this church for next month, and if I'm not right, Leroy can straighten this out. I think on the 15th of September we have Mission Sunday. And you know, Mission Sunday is the emphasis on giving to those that are in the mission field. And the Apostle Paul makes it as clear as broad daylight. When we support the gospel preacher in the mission field, we receive credit for that, if that's not the right word, and I know it. But we become a part of what he does. We have a mission as a Christian to develop in our lives the characteristics of Jesus Christ. The world needs to see that Christ is living in us. It's like the light of a city set upon a hill. It's like the salt of taste. There's a city over there. I can see it. If you're standing at our house on a cloudy night, you can see the lights of Galion. You can see the lights of Mansfield. We know there's a city over there. Our mission, God-given mission, is to become like Christ. And everybody in this room that's old enough to understand can appreciate that and know that we can see Christ living in some folks. By the way, we can see the devil in some folks too, right? Just as you can see the devil in the lives of some folks, you can see Christ living in folks. That's our mission. And our secondary mission is to take Christ to the whole world. The world may not be interested. You know, we got to get this in our heads as Christians. We're to preach the gospel, to see that it's taught. It starts at home. Then it expands to friends and neighbors and schoolmates and so forth. And it keeps expanding as long as we're alive. Our job is to preach Christ. Who's going to become a Christian? That's not our problem. The Lord takes care of that. Remember what Paul said? We're to preach the gospel, yes, to the whole world. And God will provide the increase. That's God's business. Our business is to see that it's taught. So God had a plan for Moses. God has a plan for us. There's a second thing that all of this comes to our attention. Moses underestimated his talent. You know the argument that he can't talk? You ought to read the rest of the book of Exodus. Aaron's doing all the talking, and then all of a sudden, Moses is doing it. So what was the first excuse? An excuse. Moses underestimated his talent. And there are thousands upon thousands of Christians today in this country that underestimate their talent for Christ. You know, we all have talent, and by the way, I don't want to get off onto that because that's our subject at 5 o'clock. I'll just simply say right now, we underestimate our talent. Well, I can't, and I hear this all the time, I can't tell anybody what to do to become a Christian. I just can't do that. I don't have that ability. But just ask those same people, who should I vote for? They'll tell you right now. Right? Folks, the Lord's given us talent. And there's one very important principle about talent that will never go away. If we don't use the talent that we have, we're going to lose it. Okay? A few years ago, I hired a man, well, I'd hired him many years ago to paint the barn roof and the house roof, you know, way up there where the birds fly. Every year he'd show up, or every so many years he'd show up and say, Vin, it looks like I need to get up there again. Go right ahead. A few years ago he showed up. I said, how old are you? He said, I'm 84 years old. I said, you're not going to get up on my roof. Don't worry about it. I'm just fine. I've never fallen off but twice. And I'm in good shape. And I'll be up there and I'll do it. I went in and I said to, I guess it was Kathy, I can't do that. I can't do it. The next day, here he pulls in with his truck and his ladder, and he's got up on the roof before I know about it. 84 years old. How many years has he done this? All of his life. And I just went in the house and prayed, Lord, don't let him fall off. And he finished the job. You know something? That story reminds me of a lot of things. You just have to keep on keeping on, don't you? And you never get too old to keep on going. When does the Lord say you retire as a Christian? Be thou faithful unto death. You retire then. Let's don't underestimate our talent. There's one more thing that I want to mention here, and it's very important. Let's go down to verse 12. Well, let's start in verse 11 of this third chapter. Excuse me. And Moses said unto God, Who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? Now, verse 12, God replies, Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain. The first part of that is, I'll be with you. God promises that He'll be with us. God didn't make that promise to Moses alone. He made that promise to Abraham. He made it to Isaac. He made it to the Apostle Paul. He made it to us. In Matthew, Jesus said, I want you to go into all the world and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and I will be with you always. As I read that article in Sunday school class this morning, the author of it said that Paul went to his execution. For those of you who weren't in that class, went to his execution, not followed by a bunch of Christians. The only people that went with him were the soldiers and Jesus. Thank you. You've listened patiently, and I appreciate that. It's very important that we become a Christian if we're not. I think most of us in this room have done that. And when we rise out of that water grave at baptism, man, it's good to see the smiles on their faces. If you need to respond, do so now while we stand and sing.